Thanks for the introduction. So I'm going to be talking about a project that we've been working on, this specifically for, I guess, about a year and a half, where we were tasked at developing technology trajectories to get California down to a pretty aggressive goal in 2050 of 80% reductions from 1990 levels of CO2 across the economy. So this project was sponsored by the CPUC, the California Energy Commission, CARB, the ISO, and we also had some input and feedback from the governor's office sort of throughout the process, and we had some additional funding from the Energy Foundation. And I'll mention that we had some additional support from LB&L. But before I move on, I'm going to acknowledge we've got a pretty big team in the E3 office that worked on this. So in addition to myself, Amber Mahone and Snoola Price, who are here today, Ben Haley did a lot of the model development for the model that I'm going to be talking about today, as well as Jim Williams and Sam Borges, and made some significant contributions, and Nancy Ryan as well. The results of this study, we don't have a report, but we've posted all of our data and an expanded version of this deck on our website, and so the link is here as well if you want to check that out. So the modeling framework is actually pretty straightforward. We basically just built a giant calculator of the energy economy in California. So we start with all of the energy service demands, and then the user actually tells the model how they want to meet the demands. They tell the model what types of cars people are buying, what types of light bulbs, water heaters, all of the details, and it rolls all of that stock up, and it adds up how much energy are all of those end uses using given their efficiencies. And then it also calculates how much does it cost, and it calculates how much carbon is being emitted. So we've got some granularity on demand. We've got some granularity on supply as well, so the user can tell the model, how do I want to supply my electricity, how many renewables are in the system, as well as gas plants and nukes and all of that. You can specify what's going into the natural gas pipeline. Today it's just natural gas, but you could put in biogas, you can put in limited amounts of hydrogen, you could put in synthetic natural gas, and the model will have to calculate how is it producing that synthetic natural gas and what are the implications of that on the electricity sector, for example. And we have treatments for other fuels, gasoline, diesel, biofuels, all of that. So we add all of this stuff up together and we say, in each year, what does it cost? What are people paying for all of their appliances, their cars, their light bulbs? And what are they paying for fuel? And how much is all of that stuff emitting over time? And just to sort of cut to the chase, these are the scenarios that we modeled. So on the left here, these are all historical data. This is carbon emissions in the California economy from the ARB inventory. This dashed line is our reference case, which is intended to reflect current policies that are on the books in California. And then we modeled a number of scenarios that get us to this target in 2050 of 80% below 1990 levels. And we varied a lot of different things across these technologies. The goal with this tool was not to necessarily say, what is the way to get there, but what are commonalities, different strategies that would get you there? What are differences in those strategies? What can we learn about the way the energy economy behaves differently here than it does here? And I think of particular policy relevance this year, we were interested in the question of where do you end up in 2030 when you're along these trajectories? So first, I kind of want to talk about the differences in the technology scenarios that we investigated. The straight line scenario is our main scenario. This is where basically California goes big on all the things that it's already doing, energy efficiency, renewable development. We also add some new things like fuel switching. There's lots of heat pumps in this scenario, and we add a lot of zero emission vehicles. So it's things that people are generally familiar with, but all sort of accelerated to meet that 2050 target. And then from there, we did some deviations to look at some sort of specific differences in technology pathways to that target. When we compared those different trajectories, we've kind of found that there were a lot of commonalities, but there were two primary forks in the road, things that are going to dramatically change what our energy economy looks like. And the first has to do with vehicles. So we did one scenario where we relied entirely on battery electric vehicles in the light-duty fleet. All of our scenarios had by 2030 6 to 7 million zero-emission vehicles and plug-in hybrids on the road by 2030. To get to that level, it means that by 2030, about half of all new sales are of those types of vehicles. So this is really aggressive. This is something like 4 times the current governor's goal for zero-emission vehicle adoption. But in the battery electric vehicle case, we looked at sort of what you would need to support that level of vehicles. It means you need a lot more renewables. You need reinforcement of your transmission, distribution infrastructure to get the power from the high voltage down into charging your vehicles at home and at work. And we allowed those vehicles to be charged flexibly to some extent based on limited by charger availability and driving patterns and all of that. And we found that even when we let the vehicles charge flexibly, in order to integrate the amount of renewables that we need in these cases, which in 2030 is about a 50%, which is sort of consistent with the goals that are being discussed today, you still need something else to help balance the renewables. So we actually found that in the high battery case, you also probably need quite a bit of energy storage to integrate the renewables on your way down to the 2050 goal. The second scenario that we looked at had a much higher adoption of fuel cell vehicles. And so in this case, the interesting question was, how are you providing the hydrogen to fuel those vehicles? And we assumed that you're providing the hydrogen by running electrolysis that's based on the grid, and that you're using renewable energy to fuel the electrolysis. And we let that electrolysis actually operate flexibly. So you could actually absorb a lot of the excess renewable generation in times that would cause problem in the battery electric vehicle case, produce hydrogen with it, and use that to fuel your hydrogen fuel cell vehicle fleet. And that meant that we were actually okay on balancing the grid, which was really interesting. So in this case, we didn't really have a lot of energy storage. In the battery electric vehicles case, we did have a lot of energy storage, and we had sort of more infrastructure and transmission distribution investments. So, so this is something that I think is on the horizon. There are people sort of making bets. Toyota seems to be making a bet on fuel cell vehicles. I think folks in this area might be making a bet on battery electric vehicles. And where we end up actually has implications for what we need in terms of infrastructure in the electricity system. I think that's a fork that people might be a little bit more familiar with. The second fork that we identified really had to do with biomass utilization. So we have a limited supply of biomass that we're sort of modeling in this tool. We assume that California can use its population share of the whole country's biomass resources based on some DOE estimates. And basically what we find is we don't have enough biomass resources to both decarbonize the pipeline, so to replace natural gas, and fuels in the transportation sector. So it turns out that you kind of have to decide at some point which one of those sectors to go after with your biomass. If you put it in the pipeline to displace natural gas, then you can keep your buildings basically operating as they are today. You can keep your natural gas water heaters, keep your space heaters, keep your nice natural gas ranges. And now instead of fueling it with natural gas, you're fueling it with biogas that's in the pipeline. So not much has to change for that, except that you need a big ramp up of facilities that can produce biogas. If instead you divert your biomass resources into the transportation sector to take care of medium-duty and heavy-duty vehicles primarily, well, then we have a problem in our buildings, which means that the only way we can decarbonize our buildings is really just to get rid of all the natural gas end uses. And that means we have to electrify our water heaters, we have to buy heat pumps, get electric stoves, and all of that. And that means basically an end to the natural gas distribution system. And so that has that's sort of a non-reversible decision that has to be made at some point. And that's highly politically contentious, I'd say. We're looking at losing a whole industry there. So these are the sort of two types of things we wanted to look at in the model. First of all, what's different between these different trajectories that get us down to 2050, but we were also interested in what's common across all of them. And we identified that there are 4 primary pillars that are common across all of our trajectories. The first is efficiency and conservation. Regardless of what's happening in the economy, whether you're decarbonizing your buildings by electrifying them, regardless of where you're putting your biofuels, efficiency and conservation are always going to help you out. We find that in the early years, they're really helping you out on carbon. In the later years, when you've decarbonized a lot of your fuels, they're mostly just helping you out on cost. The second is fuel switching. This is switching to either electrifying your buildings, or definitely electrifying or switching to hydrogen-fueled vehicles. And we find that across all of our scenarios, we see by 2050 basically a doubling of the share of our final energy demand that's met with hydrogen and electricity. This is a huge transformation. And you see that the uptick kind of starts right in the 2025, 2030 timeframe. So this is something that has to start soon if we're going to make it to 2050. The third is decarbonizing electricity. this is pretty obvious. If we're moving all these end uses into electricity, then we better be providing that electricity with low carbon sources. And so we've got a massive build out of renewables across all of our scenarios, with the exception of one CCS case. And then the fourth is decarbonizing liquid and gaseous fuels. And this is primarily by using biofuels and potentially using synthetic fuels eventually. So that's in the outer years in our cases. I think it's of note that 1 and 2 are things that we're kind of used to doing in California. We have energy efficiency programs already. We have a framework that gets us energy efficiency. We have the RPS, and we have policies to support distributed energy in California. So, conceivably, we can use frameworks that already exist and go more aggressive and have success on sort of the first and third. But the second and the fourth, we don't really have anything in California that does that right now. And so if you're a policymaker thinking about where the gaps going forward, these are 2 areas that are going to be really important if we're going to meet 2050 goals. So the second sort of axis we wanted to investigate was the timing of our measures. So we have 2 additional cases that can shed some light on that. In the delayed deployment scenario, we basically took the same strategy in terms of technology mixes as the straight line, but we delayed some measures that were especially costly in the short term, especially in parts of the economy that might be a little bit more vulnerable or less willing to bear the burden of decarbonizing. So we scaled things back in the commercial and industrial sectors and in medium and heavy duty vehicles. In the early deployment scenario, we actually tried out some additional measures that would go towards air pollution standards. So you get the added benefit of reduced carbon and you're spending a little bit more money, but you avoid criteria pollutants in some key air quality management districts. And the story behind those is probably pretty obvious. If you go faster, it costs more, and if you go slower, it costs a little bit less. In our straight line scenario, we're projecting that by 2030, the annual cost could be somewhere between a net savings of $4 billion a year to a net cost of $11 billion a year. Those costs are the total cost of everything we're spending on appliances, vehicles, sort of all energy infrastructure, and our fuel costs. And you can see we have some pretty wide error bars there. These error bars are driven by fuel price uncertainty and by technology cost uncertainty over time. So the fact that we don't know how much a solar panel is going to cost in 2030 is going into here, as well as the fact that we don't know what gasoline prices are going to be in 2030. It looks like with the slower commercial adoption case, you might actually be able to get net cost savings if you delay some of those measures. But notably, by 2050, they're all sort of within the error bars. You can't tell which one costs the most, and it's possible that the slower commercial adoption costs you a little bit in the outer years because now you have to accelerate some of your measures and go deeper into sectors that are harder to decarbonize later on. And then I wanted to sort of show you how these costs break out as well, so you can understand sort of how the uncertainty spans a net cost of 0 when we're doing sort of all these transformative things to the economy. So these are the average household costs in 2030 that are broken out by sort of what you're spending on in relation to energy. So this is how much you're spending on your appliances net to the reference scenario. So we've basically taken all of our costs and we've subtracted out what you would have spent anyway, even if we hadn't gone down this path. So you're spending a little bit more maybe on your appliances, on your light bulbs. You're spending a bit more on your vehicle, on average, if some portion of the population is now buying a zero-emission vehicle. You're spending quite a bit more on your electricity bill, and that's for 2 reasons. First, your electricity usage is going up. This is your building-related electricity, not your vehicle-related electricity, but if we're electrifying buildings, you're going to have more electricity sales. And electricity is more expensive because we're building a lot of renewables in all these cases. We've got something like a 50% RPS with a whole bunch of rooftop solar by 2030 in this case. So electricity is more expensive in this scenario by 2030 as well. And what's paying for this basically is, we're saving a little bit of natural gas. So we got rid of some natural gas heaters. But primarily we're relying on avoided gasoline and diesel purchases to pay for this transformation in the rest of the economy. And this is pretty important. I mean, when we did this study, we were looking at natural gas price projections that were steadily growing over the next 35 years. Our low cost sensitivity had it flat from now until 2050. And I think that level is even higher than what the current projections are for the next 5 years or something. So the cost effectiveness of these is hugely sensitive to where gasoline prices are going over time, and that's hugely uncertain. So it's hard to sort of pull out strong conclusions about costs. And I want to get through this quickly so Jeff can speak. So the last thing I want to just talk about is that we were also able to say something about risk by looking at different technology trajectories. So we sort of made this risk metric that's a combination of how important is the technology in the scenario that we're studying, and how commercialized is it already. If it's not commercialized, and it's really important that it's a very high risk. If it's already commercialized and not all that important, it's very, very low risk. And so that's allowed us to sort of pull out some of the key areas if you're in the technology space where we need a lot more effort in terms of commercialization. And the key risks that we identified were primarily related to biomass and vehicles. We don't have a huge biofuels industry, and we rely on a biofuels industry pretty much across the board here, developing both in and out of California. Fuel cells, electric vehicles, and actually high-efficiency heat pumps in buildings are all really important. LED lighting is pretty important in all of our cases, but we already have LED lights, and so it's a pretty low risk measure. So with that, I want to conclude and let Jeff get some time here. I guess in conclusion, we were able to model a number of trajectories that hit a pretty aggressive target in 2030 of between 25 and 36% below 1990 levels. The costs for our sort of main case range from a net savings of $4 billion to a net cost of $11 billion annually. And critical to the success of all of our scenarios were these 4 pillars. The first being conservation and efficiency, sort of always a good idea. The second being fuel switching away from fossil fuels, definitely in vehicles, potentially also in buildings, depending on what's going on the natural gas side. The third is just sustained development of renewables, which I think we're on course to sort of pursue in the state already. And the fourth is decarbonizing liquid or gas fossil fuels. In terms of policy, we have a framework. The low carbon fuel standard gets at the liquid fuels. We don't have a complementary policy for gaseous fuels, and we found that that would maybe be helpful in a case if you want to keep the natural gas utilities around. And the fifth, I didn't talk about, given that this is the energy seminar, but it also turns out that non-energy GHGs are critically important in this. If we didn't do any measures with respect to non-energy GHGs, these would sort of eat up our entire 2050 budget. And it can be a lot harder to reduce GHGs, and we have a lot less data and a lot less is known, I think, about reducing those. So more data is needed and more research is needed, but those are not as interesting to talk about, but should not be forgotten. And finally, just a plug. This same modeling framework that we used for this study was also used in the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project, which is an international effort of 15 country teams. Combined, they have over 70% of the global emissions. And so each of the country teams went off and tried to develop a technology strategy for their country. And I think that the idea was that those technology strategies would help feed into discussions in Paris later this year. So if you're interested in sort of the global picture on this front, we've got a study available using sort of a similar modeling framework, and the link is here. And with that, I think I'll hand it over to Jeff.
I got to introduce him real quick. Thanks so much, Elaine. Applause at the end. So our second California policy modeling superhero is Jeff Greenblatt. Jeff got his PhD from Princeton in chemistry in 1999 and then moved to NASA Ames, Princeton, EDF, and then RE is less than C at Google. You may remember that, and worked with Dan Riker. I think I met him at that point. He was on a LBNL review committee with Dan, and before I knew it, he was working at LBNL. Before I knew it, he was actually the chief modeler in a project that Jim Sweeney and I and others were on the advisory board for, which I think was kind of a seminal project for the California Council on Science and Technology. So it was a pathway type effort for the state of California. How many years ago? 3 years ago? 4 years ago?
Published in 2011.
Yeah.
A couple years of work before then. So.
And he continues to do kind of low carbon technology assessments and transitions, of course. Jeff.
Thank you, John.
Oh, you already have.
Oh, and one correction. I got my PhD at Berkeley, actually, not Princeton, but it's okay. Everyone, yeah. I spent 4 years at Princeton, so I feel like I almost got it. Yeah. It's all a great part of my education, so very grateful for it. Okay, so I think if I just go to the next slide. Thank you, Elaine, and there I am. So thank you all for listening to this double header. So this is what Lawrence Berkeley Lab did around the same time that E3 was doing their analysis for the state of California. We got a small amount of funding from the Air Resources Board to do our own look, and we did things a little bit differently. What we decided to do, or what we were asked to do, was to look at what the effects of all of the current and anticipated policies that California had at their disposal in order to see what the combined effects on greenhouse gas emissions for the state would give us. Essentially, in a way, to see how much more we would have to do in case we didn't hit our 2020, 2050, or now 2030 targets. And so I'm going to go through that, and you'll see a lot of similarity, though, in the way that we modeled. There's separate models, separate teams, but you'll see that there's a lot of intellectual commonality. Just so that you know where to find this, this work does exist as 2 written reports. The first was published in late 2013. It's an LBL report with this number here. You can find it online if you just Google it. And more recently, at the beginning of this year, we had a follow-up study that goes into a little bit more detail, published in Energy Policy. And all the figures are mostly taken from this Energy Policy study. So we also have a model of the California energy economy, and we include non-energy greenhouse gas emissions as well here. But basically, it is of a similar design in that it is a model where we tell it what the demand is going to be, and then the model figures out how it's going to meet that demand through a range of energy supply technologies, which we can also specify how much biomass is it allowed to use, what's the mix of generation types in the electricity sector. You have a certain amount of travel demand needed, but what is going to be the fuel efficiencies and mix of technology types in the light duty, heavy duty, and so on sectors in order to meet that demand. So it's kind of a flow of information where we give it high-level information and the basic drivers, things like population, of course, which is an overlying factor for everything. And then it feeds into these different sector models that give that specify demand and other parameters like the efficiencies. And it feeds over into a set of fuel supply modules, hydrogen, electricity, and then all fuels, both fossil and non-fossil, all of which, together with non-energy emissions of greenhouse gases, give a total greenhouse gas emissions footprint here. And by the way, although this isn't the focus of this talk, we were also asked to look at criteria pollutant emissions, things like nitrogen oxides and particulate emissions that come primarily from power plants and transportation, because there's also some goals that the EPA has set rather stringently that the state is going to have to meet. And so there was a secondary effort to look at how far we could go down that path too. So what we did is we looked at, as I said, all existing and contemplated policies that California has on the books, as it were, which we divided into 3 sets of policy scenarios, and then this one which we call the counterfactual, or the S0 scenario, where we turn everything off and see how much worse things would be if we had none of these climate policies, as a way to see how much we've improved already given the policies that are already underway. So this committed policies is the first tranche. It has about 13 policies discretely listed here. It's all policies that are underway or extremely likely to be implemented by 2020 is kind of the language we've used. Of course, there's always some uncertainty about what will really be implemented, but these are all law or codified policy with a clear way that it's going to be funded. Unlike the uncommitted policies, which could include some things that are on the books, but it's a little unclear whether they're going to be able to be implemented as planned, and so we put things in that category that are sort of in an in-between stage where there's some explicit information about what they are, but we're not quite sure. It doesn't quite go in this category. So that's our S2 policy scenario. And there's about another 15 or so policies in there. And then finally, our most aggressive one, and by the way, this includes everything in S1 as well in the S2 scenario. And then S3 includes S1 and S2. And in addition, it adds some more speculative policies or the results of technology evolution. Things like more aggressive vehicle technology, autonomous vehicles, we have a little bit of that in there. We have things like the building electrification that Elaine talked about, that there's no explicit policy for that in the state, so we couldn't really put that in either of these categories, so that's a potential policy. And a number of other things too, which are mostly extensions of existing policies we have, like increasing the renewable portfolio standard considerably beyond what was in S2 or S1. So there's about another 18 or so there, and in total we model 49 discrete policies that the state has at its disposal that it could mix and match, and we see what the impacts of each of these are on statewide greenhouse gas reductions. So with this framework in mind of sort of these three policies plus a counterfactual, I'm going to show you sort of the bottom line of where we got to, and you can see the similarities and differences from E3's modeling right away. These are kind of the top line results here. The first thing you will see is that we have this, we have the same eventual target here. Here's the 2020 level of going back to the 1990 level emissions, just over 400 million tons annually. The 2050 target of an 80% reduction below the 2020 or the 1990 level, so this is around 85 million tons. And then this proposed 2030 target that the governor recently announced, a 40% below 1990 level, and a straight line that had connected just the 2020 and 2050 before this one was officially announced. And then with that context, you can see the four sets of scenarios. So what do we see here? Well, first of all, you can see that there is a considerable improvement in going from sort of the do-nothing scenario to any one of these three, right? So if we undo the policies, emissions promptly go up, and they continue to go up indefinitely, and we're absolutely, we're nowhere near the targets that we want. So we need all of these additional policies in order to keep us on track toward 2020 and beyond. All three of these levels of policy aggressiveness meet or exceed the 2020 target, so that's the next observation. And in 2030, some combination of purple and some of the policies in this green scenario could meet or even go below the 40% reduction target, but you don't get nearly close enough following just the policies in this S1 or the set of existing policies that California currently has. So there is, of course, going to be additional policy action needed in order to get us to this 2030 target. And of course, the governor has recently made some announcements saying that we're now going to push the RPS to 50%, and we're going to double the efficiency of buildings and several other things. And so that is very much needed in order to get us down to that level. But the thing that is also interesting and is very much in contrast with E3's modeling is we were not trying to get to the 2050 target. We were trying to see what the effect of all of these policies that we considered feasible for the state to implement, how far that would get us. And you can see that if we only, again, stick with what's in our sort of committed policies, emissions sort of level out around 2030, and then they start to creep up again. And certainly we make no further progress. If we add the ones that are uncommitted, but are a little bit more likely to be implemented, we have a significant decrease between sort of now and 2030, but again, things sort of peter out. And even the most aggressive set of scenarios do not meet the 2050 target. In fact, they end up being roughly twice this target. Now, there's uncertainty associated with these, as you can see by these colored bands here. And that includes uncertainty as far as population growth and economic growth, but also some uncertainties as far as the underlying parameters. And so we've tried to capture that uncertainty there. So this tells us that there is a lot of policy choice left to make, but that even if we did everything that we had considered, we're going to have to do more in order to reach the 2050 target. And any of you sharp-eyed listeners realize that there are some things that E3 has done that were not captured in these scenarios. Building electrification is one, but there's some other things that I'll highlight as well. Just to put this in a different perspective, we also looked at what are called the cumulative emissions. So instead of looking at annual emissions, we look at what happens to the total amount of emissions between 2010 and 2050. this idea that you have a carbon quota that you can't really exceed. And what's interesting here is compared to this reference scenario, which is essentially the integral of that straight line that I showed in the previous figure, which tops you out at around, oh, I don't know, something like 12 billion metric tons of CO2 by 2050. You can see that the green and the purple actually stay under this curve, with the purple one until about 2040 or so, and for the green one, the most aggressive scenario, well beyond 2050. And so if you were looking at policy not from what you need to emit in a particular year, but integrated over time, all the early reductions that we see in these two scenarios pay dividends because it now allows us to stay under this target, if this target is in fact the one that we're supposed to be trying to aim for. So it's just another way of looking at the total problem in terms of an integrated emissions picture that might be valuable. I mentioned the uncertainty analysis already, so I won't dwell here, but the components that contribute most to the uncertainty in those bands are the gross state product growth rate, building efficiency improvement amount, and population. And so really these dominate that band, and the others are fairly modest by comparison. So how does everything break down by sector? You just see the total, but you wonder, well, what's really going on underneath the hood that is causing us to get to a certain level of emissions? And I know that there's a lot going on here, so I'm only going to focus on a couple of areas. You can see the huge difference between the do-nothing scenario and the most aggressive scenario. Essentially, almost all of the sectors are reducing their emissions very significantly versus in this case where there's sort of a slight growth in all scenarios. And this is because of the product of several factors. You've got demand, which is for energy, which is increasing if you don't do anything. And the demand is actually going down through increased energy efficiency for these in varying degrees. But you also have a lower carbon footprint for the fuels that are being consumed that contribute to this much decreased greenhouse gas emissions. But you can also see, and I'm going to get back to this in a couple of slides, that there are some areas, some sectors where the emissions have gone almost to zero and others that have really not changed that much. And I highlight this orange band in particular, the industrial sector. So the reason why nothing changed in the industrial sector is because we didn't have any policy to really attack that. And as a result, nothing changes in our energy system between now and 2050. And this then becomes one of the areas that you would want to focus on more as you step back and say what more needs to be done. So I'll get back to that in a moment. The other thing that our study did is we looked at the greenhouse gas impact of each of the 49 policies that we modeled individually. So essentially we had this basket of policies which say formed our S1 scenario, roughly 13 of them. And then we took one away at a time and asked how much higher would emissions be if that was not there, but everything was working in concert. And this allows you to weigh the relative contribution of individual policies. And we didn't just do it at a single point in time, but we did it by decade from 2020 to 2050. And then we rank ordered them. And I know this is very small, but I'm going to show you on the next slide sort of an example of what these look like individually for the sensitivities of S1 here. So the most important of all of the existing policies is our light-duty vehicle efficiency greenhouse gas standards, which we call S1.1. And this is essentially doubling the fuel efficiency of all passenger vehicles. It was called the Pavley rule. It was then adopted nationally, so it is our national federal standard. And it is a really big deal because it saves us about 20 million tons per year in 2020, and that increases to about 40 million tons as those more efficient vehicles work their way through the vehicle fleet and replace the inefficient cars and trucks that are left there. So that's actually the most impactful single policy, not saying how much this might cost relative to others, but just in terms of the value of that policy. The next most important one is the 33% renewable portfolio standard. And again, here this saves us almost 20 million tons in 2020, but it continues to pay dividends as we go up. And that's because energy use continues to grow, and so there's a greater savings. You can see that there's a number of others that are also important. And even these little ones here, like phasing out the once-through cooling of some inefficient power plants, it only saves a few million tons, but that combined with another half dozen or so add up to significant levels of savings. But this is very useful for policymakers who are wondering how effectual was this policy versus another. And so we've done this not just for this set of policies, but all three of the scenarios that I've shown here. And sort of putting them all together and rank ordering them, across all three of the scenarios and all 49 policies, we have concluded that the most sort of the top 5 policies are that vehicle efficiency standards, as I said, the renewable portfolio standard in the electricity sector, and perhaps less well appreciated, the phase out of imported coal power is something that's happening. We have a lot of power from out of state that is no longer, our contracts are ending and we're not renewing them, and it's going to be replaced by probably a combination of natural gas and more renewables. And this is going to save us about 20 million tons starting in 2030 when the phase out is more or less complete. And that is actually a pretty big policy change all by itself. Also, the plan to make buildings more efficient, if it is implemented as intended by the CPUC, would have very large savings out to 2050. But the big question here is, will this be implemented as planned? And I think E3 was a little more sanguine in how much efficiency they assumed could be put into the building stock. We just said, well, you know what, if you say that you're going to make these 50% more efficient, let's say for new construction, we just push that through and allowed it to propagate through the entire building stock by 2050. And yeah, if you did that, then you would have a much more efficient building stock. But there's still a question of whether that's something that can be implemented without a lot of cost. The last thing to highlight, this is actually something because we look not just in the energy system, but also emissions of greenhouse gases that sit outside. One of the most important non-energy policies was the phase out of hydrofluorocarbons, or HFCs. These are ones that are used for refrigeration and air conditioning systems, and they're also used industrially to make foam and fire retardants and things like that. And the emissions of these throughout all parts of that economy contribute about, it's several tens of million tons today. And if these were phased out by 2050, we would save an additional 26 million tons of CO2 equivalent by not having these around anymore. And so this is a really important strategy as well for bringing down the overall emissions. Now, I only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to skip a couple of these other things because there's just not enough time talking about the changes in the electricity sector, but I'm not going to dwell on this now. I want to talk about sort of our take on the building sector, and then I'm going to show you sort of what's left to do. So those are the last couple of things. Do I have time for that, John? Yeah, a couple minutes? Okay. Very quickly here. The difference between our least and most aggressive scenarios for making buildings more efficient was essentially how much of the buildings got retrofit by 2050. So essentially that every time you have a building that already exists and it's up for sale, you can have an opportunity to go in there and also do an energy efficiency retrofit or leave it alone. And current policy is fairly weak on this, so only a small fraction of buildings that are turned over get retrofit. If instead, in this more aggressive scenario, we assume that a much higher fraction of buildings were retrofit, you see that by 2050, all of them get touched. And as a result, a lot more of the building stock has the opportunity to be more efficient. And so when we do this, we make some assumptions about how much more efficient they are as a whole for both electricity and gas. So this is showing the difference in a per building energy usage in sort of the untouched stock and the more efficient stock. And if we also include building electrification, which is essentially replacing the burning of natural gas for making heat with an efficient heat pump, as Elaine had said, then that also has a big significance in terms of the average energy use. It pushes up the amount of electricity use per building, but it greatly reduces the amount of gas. And the difference is that you have, again, more electricity being used, but less gas, and this has a net effect on reducing greenhouse gas emissions because the electricity is much lower carbon than the gas that it's displacing. So that's one thing that I wanted to show you, that we have a similar approach there. And this is just more detail here that I don't have time to go through. I'm happy to go back and talk about the vehicles as well, but it's not that dissimilar from what E3 had done. The last thing is, what else would need to be done even if we did everything in S3? What's there left to do that's causing that factor of 2 difference in 2050? So what we have here, which is sort of incremental on top of the older policies, as I mentioned, are this phase out of hydrofluorocarbons, so this red line goes to 0 by 2050. And we have building efficiency, electrification, which greatly reduces the thickness of these two lines, the residential and commercial buildings. But what isn't there, we don't have really any policy in the industrial sector, so this orange line basically doesn't change its thickness at all. And then we have this category called other, which are things like agriculture, emissions of natural gas from our distribution system. We've got some other sort of miscellaneous emissions, and because there's policy silence on these don't change either, and this is an opportunity where we can continue to reduce the emissions from those miscellaneous sectors. And finally, the last bit, you can see that the emissions from the electricity sector in our model has been greatly reduced by 2050, but it's still not 0, or it's not as low as it could be. And the reason is that our policy doesn't really push us all the way to the limit to getting rid of all the natural gas that's used for load balancing. We were fairly conservative about how much energy storage would be available or the amount of renewables compared to your most aggressive scenario. So there's some more work that can be done here and that would need to be done. And then finally, transport. Only a certain fraction of the light-duty vehicles are electrified. There's relatively little done in the heavy-duty vehicle sector or in the so-called other modes, off-road, marine transport, airplanes, and so on. Very modest efficiency gains, and they're still burning diesel fuel with only a limited amount of biofuel substitution. And so here is really where the remaining action is going to need to be from a policy point of view. And together, all of those things could then squeeze this down by another factor of 2. All right, so with that, I think that we're well on the way to getting to the governor's 2030 goal, but we're going to have to do more to get all the way to 2050. And yeah, I just have too much in here. I'm just going to quickly go through it. These are the things that the governor proposed back in January that's putting us on this downward path here. But I'm going to conclude now with these points. Which is that our policies are sufficient to meet the 2020 target, but then depending on how aggressive we are after that, we have a wide range of possible emissions in 2030. And as I've been saying, that we need to do even more from a policy perspective to get us to the 2050 target. And finally, that being able to look at the impact of greenhouse gas emissions one policy at a time can help policymakers and others weigh the various priorities that we have. So with that, I thank you. All right.
I'm going to call Elaine back up so we have time for questions. Students first. This is our normal student questions.
Students first.
Student questions. Students all studying for exams. Are you a student? You look like a student.
Thanks. I was wondering if you could comment on the idea of like a feedback mechanism. You'll do your simulations, your modeling on policies, and does that influence upcoming policies, and then you keep essentially remodeling? Is that something? Is that a motivation you have in doing this?
Feedback policy. We'll both probably answer that. So one of the challenges in doing a very comprehensive economy-wide model is how much detail and how much time it takes to sort of build it all. And so I think in both of our cases, we adopted a very prescriptive approach where we imposed certain policy choices or the availability of certain technologies, and we said how they would go into the economy. And there really wasn't any feedback from an economic point of view, like, oh, well, the reason why people are buying these vehicles is because they're now cheaper. Well, would that then mean that people would buy them more rapidly than the policy would say, or they would? So similarly, from a policy point of view, yeah, we don't really anticipate that the success of one policy means that lawmakers would then go ahead and push things further. We simply have different levels of stringency. So we have, for instance, a 33% RPS, which is the current policy by 2020, and then further policy variations push that number higher. But it really doesn't depend on other things going on other than there's a general higher level of aggressiveness overall for that scenario. You want to say something different?
Yeah, I would just add that I think we had a pretty explicit goal in our project to provide insight but not pick winners, and that's because we were doing this work for the state agencies, and so there's a desire to be sort of technology agnostic on some level and identify where are there opportunities, where are there maybe dead ends. but not to use a study that was sponsored by the state to push one technology over another. So I think the goal is to develop an aggressive policy that gets us to 2050, and hopefully that, once you have the policy, things become cost effective, and that'll drive more technology development. But it's sort of a difficult balance to strike when you're being so prescriptive about each scenario.
And there's still so much uncertainty about what technologies really are going to be successful.
Right.
So the policies say we want to push zero emission vehicles, for instance, so many by 2025. But I think it's going to be very iterative. In reality, we're going to see how well they're selling and how good the performance is, and people like us will calculate, okay, well now we think the greenhouse gas emissions are going to be higher or lower than we originally thought, and then policymakers will respond to that information probably.
Any other student questions? Students? College. I'll rein myself in. See, they're leaving now. Okay, non-student questions. Yes, sir.
Well, actually, I'll start with the first one regarding health effects, because I know converting from fossil fuels to all renewable electricity devices improves air quality. Either of you want to comment on benefits independent of these costs?
That's an important point. We added up costs and we completely ignored benefits. I think with the assumption that if you're putting a policy in place that gets you along any of these trajectories, that you're sort of implying that the societal benefits are outweighing the costs, whatever costs we're calculating, and those societal benefits could be things like health. But we don't try to quantify any of that.
I would say, so we did, as I mentioned at the beginning briefly, we did look at the emissions reductions of criteria pollutants, which have a major contribution to health, to public health. I just wanted to show you. These are the 3 criteria pollutants that we modeled, and you can see that particularly NOx, nitrous oxides, and particulate matter, they're great reductions compared to today. I just have this on a relative scale. And so while we didn't calculate the health benefits, clearly there are very large gains to be made here. But I think and I think it's valuable because it is such a big deal to explicitly look at health as a so-called co-benefit of a greenhouse gas reduction strategy. But I will say that once you start going down that road, you probably want to look at other benefits as well. And then it becomes a little bit more of an open question of what else should we also be including? The benefits of exercise if you're riding your bike more. No, seriously, people look at that as an important side benefit of getting out of cars.
Jim Sweeney.
Jeff, Elaine talked about some of the costs of what she's doing. Could you tell us what you've learned about the costs of pursuing these various policy strategies? There's some of them, particularly when you're causing retrofits of all individual homes, those are not low-cost strategies.
Yeah, so we explicitly did not model costs, which is a shortcoming of our study compared to E3s, and it's really great that you guys were able to put those in, to give, even though you have uncertainty around it, to have some estimates of what the total cost would be. I wish that I had been able to do that, but there just wasn't, time, budget, et cetera. But Jim, specifically to your question about building retrofits, yes, I have, as you kind of heard from my comments on that, as I was introducing it, I have grave doubts about the ability for us to cost effectively do those retrofits. Now, there's people within the building community who feel that there are some tricks that one can do to lower the cost, standardizing procedures, getting rid of very expensive and individualized modeling and verification of savings. If you can sort of just impose more of a cookie cutter approach, on average you can still get net savings and maybe save some more money that way. But I also think that focusing perhaps more on the new buildings, and about 50% of the buildings in California will be new by 2050, because there's population growth and so on, that there might be greater cost savings there in the direction that we end up going.
Can I add really quickly? I said efficiency is always a good idea. The one efficiency measure that we did not use in any of our scenarios was shell measures, so insulation, new windows, things like that. That was the one thing that did increase costs.
Increasing the efficiency of appliances that are turned over every
Right.
10 to 20 years is obviously an easier thing to do than going in and touching the building shell.
That's right.
Other questions?
Yeah.
Howard? Oh, sorry.
Thank you. I'm wondering how you would take into account the emission from a power plant to determine how many or what the amount would be from natural gas or the substitution from coal to natural gas, nuclear, and so on, and how it all melds into some kind of an estimate of the emissions that you calculate.
Yeah, so the electricity system is a complicated sector to model, right? So you have to have some rules about how you're going to meet. So the way our model worked, and I think yours is similar, but you guys did things slightly differently. We start with a calculation of how much electricity the state's going to require. So that's
The total amount.
yeah, the total amount. And it's not even looking at different regions because we really just did things at a statewide level. So based on just demand from buildings, but also changes in electricity demand from more electric vehicles, electric heat pumps, et cetera, that tend to push up that total. But we come up with a total demand. And then we have a set of criteria that we have to meet, right? So you need to make a third of your electricity renewable. So that's the first thing that my model does. And then it says, well, how much nuclear power do I still have? Oh, well, there's only one plant running now, so I'm going to take that. How much hydropower do I have? I take that. That's not something you can increase up or down. So essentially, you're kind of whittling it down to what's left. And once you got rid of the coal plants and you've used up all of your renewables, what essentially you had left as kind of the balance point was natural gas. And we used as efficient of a natural gas plant as we could. But you could obviously have policies that focused more on pushing something other than natural gas as your backup power, and that would give you a different answer. Yeah, you're welcome.
Great. The boss says one more question. We have about 90 seconds. Sir.
So the average consumer may not be concerned with energy efficiency and things like that, and I believe that there's a lot that we can gain just by addressing people's behaviors. Do you have any ideas of what measures may be implemented to kind of increase awareness about what we're facing as a nation in terms of like carbon emissions, things like that? Like, what can we do to involve more people in this task?
Want to take that?
Well, that's an easy one.
I just okay.
No, I'll say we were really conservative on behavior, I think, in our model. So people are generally living similarly. We have some vehicle miles traveled reductions based on sort of increased urbanization, things like that. But we don't sort of assume big behavioral mode changes in the economy. But we go really aggressive on technology adoption. So it might be a trade-off that maybe you don't need to go so aggressive on buying the ZEV if we have more people biking, things like that. In terms of how do we get people to change their behavior, that's a really hard question.
There's a bit of history here.
Back to Jeff.
It's very short, but there's a bit of history here. I would say that overall modelers have been a little reluctant to try to model behavior, partly because they don't understand what really drives it, partly because it's considered sort of squishy, and it's so much easier to just say, well, I'm just going to stick with the stuff I know how to build, right? Technology A gets substituted for technology B. It's an area that has also been historically underfunded, understanding how behaviors, how decisions are made by individuals. And so I would say that we would like to know a little bit more about that before we can put it into a model, but absolutely we want every tool in the toolkit available for carbon reduction, so it's an important one.
Great, we're at the end of our time. Thanks one last time to Jeff and Elaine for a great talk.